This is Dave with Taboo Customs. This video we're going to cover the install of our Jeep TJ rust repair kit for the area at the rear axle where the control arms, the upper and lower control arms meet. This is one of the most common areas that the Jeep TJ is rust. Now we've got a late 90s TJ here, and you can see with this TJ that we have a hole in the bottom and a hole in the side. Often you'll also get a hole on the inside where the upper control arm mounts, but all the TJs can rust a little bit differently. This one is actually pretty solid where the control arm mounts, but the outside and the bottom here, as you can see, have rusted through. Now when you're looking at your TJs, this was not very apparent before we started cleaning it out. You actually couldn't even see this hole in the side, so it can kind of hide from you. You have to be very cognizant that you have to look at this area and make sure that it's not rusted out and that it is structurally sound. Now before we start the install, we've prepped the Jeep. We've disconnected the battery, we've removed the fuel tank, and we've put it up on jack stands so that we can start to remove some of the suspension components from this Jeep. So before we start disassembling the Jeep, let's run through the kit real quick. In the kit you're going to get a couple of plates, one for the outside which has the cutout for the body mount, and one for the inside. You'll get a bottom plate here, which is the long narrow plate, and you'll get a couple of gussets. Now these gussets are actually to go around the body mount to help strengthen this area of this outside plate that's pretty thin here. You can put those and they'll go around the body mount like that. Now the other plates here are actually to replace the inside upper control arm mount. These are thicker 7-gauge plates, so they're heavy duty. Now this mount is designed to be either used on the passenger side or the driver's side, and the only thing that will change is whether you put this plate on top. So the plate on the driver's side will end up going on top like this, but on the passenger side you'll flip it over. You'll also get a couple of sets of instructions that will run you through how to install this kit and also how to put this mount together to make sure you get it put together the right way for the side that you're putting it on. So for the next step, we'll need to start disassembling the Jeep. What we're going to need to do is we're going to need to take the control arm mounts off at the frame location. So you'll need to completely disconnect them from our frame locations, and then we recommend also loosening them at the axle, so that way you can move those control arms out of the way. We'll need to take the sway bar link off at the frame connection as well. And then, since we're on the driver's side, as the kit works both for driver and passenger side, we'll need to go in here, remove or pull the fuel lines, the brake line, the vent line. We'll need to remove all of that from the frame, from back here all the way up to just in front of the transfer case, so that we can pull all those lines over towards the transfer case and get them out of the way as we install our kit. Now if you're working on the passenger side, you're going to have to remove the exhaust, which can be a bit of a pain with the exhaust, because exhaust tends to be rusted in place. So you may actually have to take a Sawzall, cut that exhaust off, and then splice it back together, or put new exhaust on it when you put it back together. So before we start taking these apart, we're going to cover the sizes you're going to need. To get the lower control arm apart, you're going to need 21mm hardware. Everything will be in metric for the suspension area of the Jeep. Before we started taking this apart too, we've also supported the axle with some jack stands. We don't have a lot of weight on the suspension. We just want to support that axle so that it doesn't fall. For the upper control arm, it'll be, I believe, all 18mm hardware. 15mm hardware here for the upper control arm. 18mm hardware for your sway bar connection here. You'll also need a 13mm socket or wrench to take the brake line off of the upper control arm, and then you'll need one Torx T40 bit or something else to disconnect or to unbolt the brake line from the actual upper control arm inside the frame. Alright, so we've got the suspension now all loose. We've got the hoses and everything on the inside of the frame pulled back away. A couple of things when you're going and you're removing the suspension, it typically comes apart pretty easy, especially everything that's up kind of high. The areas that we typically have problems with are going to be the lower control arm bolts, and this Jeep was no exception. We had issues with the lower control arm bolt and actually had to cut this bolt to get it out. What typically happens on control arms and leaf springs is that the bolt will rust into this bushing that's inside of the control arm bushing here, the basically spacer, the sleeve that's inside the bushing, and then that makes it difficult to get out. For us, we heated it up enough to where the rust released itself from, or it got released between the bolt and the sleeve, and we were able to hammer it out. But in the process of that, we destroyed the bolt, which is pretty typical. So for the next step, what we're going to need to do is we're going to cut both the lower and the upper control arm mount off. But before we do that, we're going to need to take some measurements to make sure we put them back in the same place. So on the instructions that we sent you, we did leave a couple of spaces for you to record your measurements. Now the first one we'll look at is this lower control arm mount. So for the lower control arm mount, what we do is we'll measure from the top of the frame to the bottom edge of the control arm mount. And they're typically 8 inches, which this one is right at 8 inches. Now for the distance back, we'll use the body mount and go from the body mount back to the edge of the control arm mount. And this one is just about 11/16, which it's kind of interesting with TJs and with OEMs. This can actually vary. The height stays pretty accurate, but we see the distance back vary from Jeep to Jeep. But what we're wanting to do is we're wanting to try to get this back in the same place for this Jeep. So that's why we're taking these measurements. We give you some rough measurements in the drawing, or excuse me, in the instructions, but that's if you really this fell off and it's gone, or you're not able to replicate where this was, because sometimes with these TJs, these will rust so bad that this will actually fall off. Now typically you can kind of put it back up there and see where it was at based on a material that's broken away, but if you can't do that, we give you some rough measurements. Alright, so for the inside bracket, what we're going to do is we're actually going to do something a little different, because we are replacing this inside bracket, and the new bracket is not exactly the exact same shape. So we're going to go off the center hole of the inside bracket. So for that, what we're going to do is we're just going to use the tub as a reference point, and we're going to measure to the center hole. So from the tub to the center of the hole, this one here is at 2 3/4. Now yours will vary because it'll vary on the body mounts, and like some TJs, the body mounts will start to rust and the tub will actually start to drop. But as long as the tub doesn't move while we're in the process of doing this and we put it back in the same place, we should be pretty good. Now for the distance front to rear, what we'll do is we'll actually take and we'll put a mark on the bottom of the tub where we'd like to have that. And so we're going to use 8 inches, and we're going to mark the bottom of the tub, and then when we go to reinstall our new control arm bracket, we will look at putting it 8 inches back from that mark. Now the upper control arm bracket's location is not nearly as critical as the lower, and for the lower, really what's critical is to try to get this front to rear dimension in the same place, because that's what's going to initially control whether the Jeep wants to dog track or not. And like I said, we're just trying to get it back in the same place it was for this Jeep. So now that we have those dimensions, what we can do is we can cut off both the lower and upper control arms. Now we start with the lower control arm, and what we'll do is we'll take a hard wheel and we'll cut flush right along the bottom edge of the frame, because that will get us pretty close to where the cut would be when we go to reinstall this on our new bracketry. Now once we get that off, then we'll work on cutting off this upper control arm. Now the upper control arm we're not saving, so we can beat on it and bend it, and by the time we're done it'll end up a little bit mangled anyway. But there'll be 3 welds on the upper control arm you'll need to cut. The back weld, or excuse me, I guess the front weld, the back weld, and then this weld along the bottom. Now for the lower control arm, like I said, we'll cut along here flush to the bottom, and then you also have to cut this front area here to take this off. Once you have all that off, you're going to need to take off what extra parts you have left, such as this section here of the lower control arm, because we'll need both the inside and the outside of the frame flush down to the frame to put on our new parts. Alright, so we've gone in, we've removed the lower control arm bracket, and we've removed the upper control arm bracket on the inside. Now that is the probably biggest pain in the butt part about this whole thing, because it's hot and it's dirty and it's a pain in the tail, honestly. The blower bracket is not so bad. What we do for the upper bracket is typically we'll just go in, we'll make a couple of big cuts, get the bulk of it out of the way, and then you get left with little pieces. What we recommend on those little pieces then is going in and trying to cut where it's actually welded, and then take a chisel and a hammer and chisel underneath it and peel it back so you can pop that back at the weld. So some of them, like this one on the inside, we'll take and we'll start rolling it up from the bottom. So for that, make sure you've got your PPE. If you've got a face shield, when I was doing it, I had a face shield and hearing protection and welding gloves on. I kind of wished I would have had longer sleeves and stuff like that, but hey, nobody said I was smart. Anyway, I would recommend trying to make sure you're wearing all your PPE when you're doing that, because it is not fun. So after you get that done though, it's all downhill from there. What we did then is we took a grinder, we flattened off all the welds that were on the outside and on the inside, because now we're going to start putting our panels up here to replace the areas of the frame that are bad. So with that, what we're going to do, you'll take each of the inside and outside panels, once I can get them picked up, put it up there. Now they're going to roughly go flush with the bottom of the frame. Then mark out the perimeter of those panels. And the back, you're going to want to mark right about there, because that's where the bottom piece will roughly end. You're going to want to mark out your body mount here, because you're going to want to clean up around that, and then do it around the front. So now you have basically a layout of the perimeter. What you're going to need to do is go and clean all the clean all the rust and paint and everything from that perimeter, so that we can go in there and weld. And you're going to want to make sure you get down to good solid material on the frame before we do that. Alright, so we've gone in, we've cleaned up the inside and the outside of the frame, as well as the bottom. Whenever we do this, we'll use a lot of different things, because this is actually a really important step, because to get good welds, you're going to need good clean material. So we'll go in, and we've got a needle scaler that we'll go in, we'll take a lot of the heavy scale off. Then we'll follow that up maybe with a electric grinder with a 4-inch grinding disc on it. We'll also use a small die grinder, 90-degree die grinder, to get in the smaller areas, or even a small bit, and this is what we'll actually use to get up inside this body mount enough so that we can get good welds on it. And then we'll follow it up and we'll clean it up with a wire wheel, just to make sure we got all that scale and everything else off of the frame. So when you do the inside plate and you mark it out, you'll want to mark it all the way up to the front, obviously, and then to the back. Now at the back, the plate will come up to the sway bar mount here at the frame, and typically those mounts are high enough up on the frame that they don't have an issue with rusting out. I mean, you can see how bad this frame is, but yet pretty much everything above this is still good material. For this, then you will have to grind off this area here, because the bottom piece, which the bottom does tend to be a little bit worse, the bottom piece will actually go up a little bit higher to make sure that we are still in good material. And once we actually form the bottom piece, you'll need to double check that and make sure it's cleaned up in those areas as well. So we've got the frame cleaned up and we can start to put our plates on. Now, one thing before we start on that, we can talk a little bit about what we do with the frame and this rust here. Now, in a lot of these cases, you'll have an area of the frame where it'll be rusted through the side and then also rusted through the bottom. So you got this little section that really isn't doing much for you, isn't really connected to the rest of the frame anymore. Now, normally we cut that out. Now, we will wait until after this step to do that, because we'll want to kind of leave it there, because it does give us the shape of the frame still for us to go by whenever we put the plates on. So we'll start with the outside plate, and we'll put the plate on. As I said, we'll want to get it just a hair under flush with the bottom of the frame. And with the outside plate, there's a section up here that the outside plate covers that the inside plate does not cover. And we can use a vice grip clamp to then clamp this plate in place here as we go in, and we'll put the inside plate on. Now, when we put the inside plate on, we'll use some vice grip clamps and some C-clamps to hold that in place. But one thing we're going to do before we get that done is we're going to form our bottom plate. So the bottom plate, you can see it'll come into flat, and we're going to need to form this radius into it. Now, with the bottom plate, you do have a hole. That hole will go, now it's offset, it's not in the center. That hole goes more towards the rear than the front. So right now what we're going to do is we're going to take this over to our table and we'll make that form, and then we'll come back. So with forming this bottom plate, what we'll do is we'll take it over to a vise and we'll start getting some rough forms into place. And then what we'll actually do is we'll come over and we'll use the disc brake, or excuse me, the drum brake of the rear axle. We'll actually use it to smooth out the form, and then also to, you know, continue to bend it as we need it. Because what we're going to want to do then is we're going to roughly fit it up there and to get it pretty close. Now, when you have it like this, you're actually pretty good, because you can put a C-clamp on here and bend it up, or you can continue to form it if you want. Alright, so we put the outside plate, the inside plate, and we put our formed bottom plate on here now. So what we did is, the second plate we put on was actually the formed bottom plate, and we started by clamping the formed bottom plate with a 6-inch C-clamp back here at the back to get it up to the bottom of the frame. We put our inside plate on, lined it up with the rear here, put this clamp on. Then we came in here, added this 6-inch clamp to the rear part of the frame to further bring this bottom plate up to the frame, and then clamped our inside plate. We then took a hammer and made sure that on both the inside to the bottom and the outside to the bottom plate, we had a good corner right here, where that corner looks like this, where here's the side plate and here's the bottom plate. So we have a good area to put a weld on the outside. But first we're actually going to tack it together, take it off, and then weld the inside. Alright, so we've gone in and we've placed 1/2-inch tacks just about every 6 inches along the bottom, and then a few more up in here closer together. The one area that you may have some trouble with is this area up here. We've had good luck with this one and in the past with putting a 6-inch C-clamp up here and just barely having enough space to be able to get that 6-inch C-clamp up there and clamp this up to the outside plate. Another area that is a little bit different is the front section here, because we do overlap the area of the frame where it starts to bend in. We don't typically worry too much about that. We get the bottom here to where the corners look good so we can get a weld on there. Once we put this on for the last time, we'll actually form those ends to meet the frame as well. So now let's take this off. And one thing to watch out for when you are welding those corners together is the one thing you don't want to do is blow through, because you don't want to weld these plates to the frame just yet. Because what we're going to do is we're going to take this whole assembly off now, and we're going to weld the inside of it. So get all of our clamps off, and then hopefully, as long as everything went well, we can now pull this assembly off, and we can weld the inside of it on our table, flip it over, go ahead and do these welds on the outside on the table. It'll be a lot easier than welding up under the frame. So as you weld this up, we'll typically start with the inside welds first. You want to make sure you keep your welds somewhat small. I mean, there is a large radius to the frame, but you're going to want to keep your weld from being what hits that radius. We're going to want this to actually hit the bottom of the frame before it bottoms out. If it does, it's not a huge deal. You just have to cut the control arm mounts. You might have to use a hammer to help close up some gaps when you go to weld it. Typically it won't be a massive deal, but you do want to keep your weld somewhat small. After you weld the inside, you can weld the outside, and we just weld both the inside and the outside solid, and then we go in and we'll clean up any spatter that we have on the inside and the outside before we install it. Alright, so now we'll need to take our assembly and we'll need to install it onto the frame. And before we did this, we actually took a little bit of spray paint. We sprayed down inside the assembly here with some black spray paint. You do that, you want to be careful that you don't get black spray paint up here on the edges where you're going to weld, or you're going to end up with some bad welds. Now to reinstall this, and typically we don't have too many issues with the towing in, but it may tow in a little bit on you, and if you do, if it tows in a lot, you may have to open it up. We'll start with the front section, slide it up to where this gets past the body mount. Then you can take a hammer and start to bring it up there. So you can see as it slid up, it started to slide back. We can now go ahead and put our 6-inch clamps on here to clamp it up to make sure that the bottom is up against the frame. And we can start welding. Now when we do that, we typically will start here at the front. We'll clamp it up. We'll start our welding, and we'll work towards the back, because sometimes we will need to clamp up. There'll be a gap here, and we'll clamp that up, and we'll use the clamps to pull that up. Alright, so we've put our two 6-inch clamps here at the bottom to pull up this bottom section. For this front section on the outside, what I found is the easiest is to take an 11R vice grip clamp to close this up. And then once we get this welded up, we'll take one of our C clamps on the inside, because we have to mesh that, or we have to push that inside so it's flush up against the frame, and then we can weld all the way up to here. Then we'll move all these clamps to the rear and we'll start welding that up. Alright, so we've got the plates all welded up on the inside and the outside. We did also fail to mention earlier that you'll want to add these two reinforcement plates, and they go around the body mount and just get solid welded to the body mount and then all around. Now, a couple of tips on the welding. If there's any gaps at all, you want to close those gaps up. Use clamps or a hammer or vice grips, whatever you need to be able to close those gaps up. And then there is also an area back in here where the body actually comes down over the frame. It can be a little bit difficult to weld. We find it easiest to weld that from the front, basically trying to follow it down. But you may have a little bit of trouble depending on what size your nozzle is. Alright, so we've got our bracket, lower control arm bracket tacked in place. And to help explain why, you know, we're developing a new lower control arm bracket. We showed you earlier how the bracket was a little bit offset and it angles out towards the outside of the axle. When it does that, it actually kind of bubbles in on the inside. So because of that, you will often end up with a large gap inside here between the lower control arm bracket and now the frame. Now before, the lower control arm bracket kind of came out and went around the frame, so they closed that up whenever they stamped those brackets. Now in our kit, until we get our lower control arm bracket developed, we've included a small spacer bar to put up inside that piece so that you can close that gap. So that way you can put a weld on the outside and then put two welds on the inside. Also, what I didn't mention is when you go to clean this up, clean up the outside, the front, the inside, and then also clean up the inside of the bracket, because what we're going to do, since we're now butt welding this, we're going to want to weld both the outside and as much of the inside bracket as possible. Alright, so for the upper control arm mount, you'll get some instructions, and there's 4 pieces to the upper control arm mount. Now, it's really important that you look at the instructions, and depending on what side of the Jeep you're doing, you make the mount for that side, because there is a difference between the driver's side and the passenger side. Now, these 2 pieces will be the same either way. This piece here will fit down inside the slot there. The big difference is whether you put this on the top of this side or this side. So, for instance, we're working on the driver's side, so this bracket is in this orientation when it's actually on the Jeep. This larger piece is the top piece, so that's the piece that's going to need to go on this side. Now, there are tabs and slots for each of these pieces, so you can kind of get it together without it being too much of a pain. So we know that piece needs to go towards me, so we'll set it up. This is the bottom piece, and it's shorter because if you remember taking the Jeep apart, the nut for this back here actually has a long piece on it to keep it locked in place whenever you're installing it and removing it. So whenever you get all of these together, you can see it pretty well just drops in place right where you need it. You know, you can double check, make sure the holes are in alignment, and then once they're in alignment, tack several places to keep it together, and then go ahead and weld it solid per the prints. Okay, so for the last step here, with the last main step, I guess, we'll need to reinstall the new upper control arm mount. To do that, what we'll do is we will install the lower control arm into the control arm mount on the frame. Sometimes to do that you will have to use a strap to kind of pull the axle to the control arm mount. Whenever we take these control arms loose, a lot of times the axle has a tendency to drift away from the mount. So you might have to pull that up to get the bolt back in. Then what you can do is take the new control arm mount it to the control arm, then get it up on the frame, and I like to take a vice grip clamp back here and clamp this on the frame. Now I wait on this front end because we'll probably need to adjust it, and pretty much every time we'll have to take and we'll have to put a strap from the top of the axle, and we typically use the track bar mount to up here to the transfer case skid plate, and we'll have to rotate that axle forward to get it to where the original measurements that we had. So our original measurements were 2 3/4 from the bottom of the tub, and then 8 inches from our mark up here, right there. So yeah, we're right on where we need to be. Now, typically when you get it there, this front corner will hang off of the frame, and that's normal. That typically, you know, for me, usually shows me that I have got it in the right place. As far as the orientation of this beyond that, it's not really hugely important. The biggest thing is to make sure that if you do have any welds that protrude above the frame here that would keep this from sitting flush against the frame, go ahead and grind those off, because you're going to want this to sit flush against the frame. So once we have this in its correct place, we can go in, solid weld as much as we can across the top, down the sides, and then I will solid weld across the bottom. Once we get that done, we are pretty much complete with the rust repair. Then we just need to, we'll go ahead and we'll take the control arms loose again, we'll paint it up, and we'll start putting everything back together. Now, one change with this control arm mount with putting it back together is the brake line bracket that usually mounts right here. Now, before, this was a self-tapping bolt that bolted into the bracket. For this, you'll have to take the little tab that sat in a hole here, just bend it out, and then put a normal 1/4 inch bolt in there to hold that in there. If you're looking to purchase one of our TJ rust repair kits, you can visit our website at taboocustoms.com. We also have several other different models of rust repair kits, as well as several other different armor products available there. If this video helped you, a like or subscribe is greatly appreciated.